It's time for Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson. And I'm your host, Tony Graham. Good afternoon, Matthew.
Hey, good afternoon, Tony. Good to be chatting technology again after this morning session. It was a good session this morning, so let's see what we've got to talk about this afternoon.
Yeah, it's very topical today. Now, it's the first topic is about renewables. Can renewables help Australia's economy recover from COVID-19? What do you think there?
Well, it's not so much what I think with this one, but there's an Ernst and Young report that's just come out that concluded that a renewables-led economic recovery will create 3 times as many jobs as a fossil fuel-led recovery. Now, keep in mind that even though it's an Ernst and Young report, it was commissioned by the conservation group WWF, and hopefully they don't change what they say because who's paying for it. But you just have to keep that in the back of your mind. But this particular report has called for a mix of incentives, subsidies and regulations to really drive the economy back on the back of renewables. And they've got some pretty good data and some interesting information. But what they're talking about here is using renewables to drive the economy, but also, quite obviously, driving some of the net zero greenhouse gas emissions targets that we're trying to aim towards by 2050 in accordance with the Paris Agreement. And so the federal government has talked about this gas-fired recovery, but the Ernst and Young report says there are some other ways that maybe we could try and drive a recovery in a different way. So they've got very specific information in this particular report. So, for example, they said if we can do some investment in manufacturing to reduce the use of gas and build new clean technology export industries, it might cost the government $520 million, but generate 22,000 jobs. And it's interesting, Tony, when you talk about $520 million, or even in some of these ones we might talk about billions of dollars, they sound like big numbers, but when you start to think about $60 to $70 billion was spent on JobKeeper alone, suddenly $500 million doesn't sound like quite as much money. But when we start to talk about the next one, they talk about making Australia a leading global battery manufacturer. $500 million there again, but that might generate 7,800 jobs. Making all our buses electric, $240 million, but 10,000 jobs there. Subsidies for solar for community organisations. I think that would work really well around places like Wellington. As we know, there's some solar farms there already, and having some community input in there and generating that from a community organisation. $500 million spent on that would generate another 5,000 jobs. And then accelerating renewable hydrogen industry. Again, $225 million there, but 1,200 jobs. So some interesting information there. And again, whether or not you follow that to the letter, I think the important part here is looking at different ways to revive the economy, and maybe renewables are a good way to do that.
Yeah, I noticed they've got some interesting ideas there, Matthew, but one of the things they're not really talking about, which is topical and very important, and that is what is the cost of electricity? We know that the cost of electricity in Australia has gone up to be about the most expensive in the world, whereas once we were one of the most cheapest. And that has affected manufacturing. And if you want to revive manufacturing, you've got to have competitive energy prices.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a complicated paradigm with all of that, just looking at exactly the relationship there. So, look, there's some interesting stuff there. But again, the important thing, I think, Tony, is we need to talk about it. We need to discuss it. We need to just say, let's not keep doing it the same old way. And maybe it's hard to look for positives out of COVID-19 at times, and especially if you've been personally impacted. But maybe one of the positives to come out of COVID-19 is we start to look at things with a clean slate rather than keep doing things the same old way.
Yeah, and of course, the thing that's got a lot of potential there is the hydrogen industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, how can police use a protester's phone against them?
Well, it's interesting, Tony, rather than seeking warrants for someone that might have, say, probable cause, so, for example, we think Tony Graham was part of a protest, let's go and execute a search warrant on Tony Graham and look at where he was and what he was doing. It's actually going backwards now, and these are called reverse search warrants. And what the authorities in the US are doing is they're going along to an organisation like a Google, and they're saying, please give us information on every phone that was in this particular vicinity. Now, with the protests on, obviously it's been relative to that, but it might be a bank robbery, it might be a crime that was committed, it might be a murder that was committed. So basically by using geofence warrants, they're able to find out information on people that were around an area and then go and work on the information there. That's their first starting point, if you like. So quite interesting. And again, people are probably not aware of this. They pick up their phone, they take their phone with them everywhere, but that information is being tracked as to where they are. So geofence warrants is something that we'll see a lot more of. Interesting area in terms of the actual legality of it all. And then you start to look at whether or not a company like Google wants to hand over that information, which they don't, but when they get a search warrant executed, they are tending to hand that information over. So for individuals trying to stop that, they need to look at some of the settings on their phone to try and limit that, or, heaven forbid, leave their phone at home if they don't want the authorities knowing where they are. But to give you an idea of how this is changing, Google saw a 15-time increase in geofence requests from 2017 to 2018, and then another 5 times increase from 2018 to 2019.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, should human bricklayers be worried about the latest bricklaying robot speed record? Now, that's been recorded by the Hadrian X construction robot. Must be a British one, is it?
This one is actually a British one, yes. So effectively, I'm not sure they should be that worried yet, but they should be maybe a little bit concerned. So the Hadrian X has just recorded 200 bricks per hour. So not a bad speed. Now, it's not quite as fast as the human record. The human record is actually held by an American, and there's an American, and he managed to, this is a record from 33 years ago, managed to lay 915 bricks an hour, which isn't too bad. I mean, I've done a little bit of bricklaying in my life, but never anywhere near 915 an hour. But the big thing with this particular bit of bricklaying from the Hadrian X is that it doesn't have problems with sick days. It doesn't have problems with getting tired. It can consistently do 200 blocks an hour all day, every day. And so it's something that some bricklayers might be a little bit worried about. And basically the Fast Brick Robotics CEO, Mike Pavick, has said that this is something that they might see with more labour shortages, more so than trying to get rid of bricklayers. There are some labour shortages across the world, and effectively this might be one of those things that helps to replace some of those labour problems.
Yes, this has been in development for some time, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has been in development. There's been some previous some bricklaying robots that have been around. This has now got the record for the fastest one, and I can see that development will continue on. And I think we're only at 200 now, but it may not be too long, maybe another year or two before that 915 an hour that Bob Boyle set as a record might actually be threatened by a robot.
Yeah. Another thing that might bring the cost of housing down, perhaps, on building costs anyway.
Yeah, it's a good point, Tony. I mean, you might get to the stage where you are getting some cheaper labour charges for that, and then every part of that house, there's a construction cost there. So I'm sure the bricklayer's charge is not the most significant cost of a house, but sure, every little bit helps in terms of that construction cost.
That's dead right. Now, you'll be listening to Tech Talk with Mathew Dickerson on Binjang 91.5. I'm your host, Tony Graham. Stay tuned next week in the morning at 10:40 a.m, next Tuesday, that is, for the next edition. And it's back to the great music and community information on Binjang.
Thanks, Tony. See you next week.
See you next week, Matthew.